thing is that they see the real survivor, and that's what we're doing. We're future-proofing against a time when all of these survivors will have sadly but inevitably gone.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
Well, I'd like to invite everyone to share my Christmas present. And my Christmas present comes from my co-host, James Mannion, who's given me the opportunity to introduce today's podcast. It's a first. I usually have to wait till he's done, but I get to do it all on my own today. And this is an exciting one. We got into a bit of a faff the first time we did this. This is indeed the second attempt, because I said this was one of the only occasions where we'd been solicited. James then moved on to tell me that he gets solicited all the time, and it's only me that gets missed out. But what I meant was that Hannah Wilson from Generation to Generation got in touch with us to ask if we would be interested in doing something around her charity and the work that they do in schools. And we jumped at the opportunity. You'll find out why if you listen to the rest of the podcast, and my introduction hasn't put you off. But we've got a splendid opportunity to hear not just from Hannah, but hear from two of her speakers, both of whom have relatives who are very directly affected by the Holocaust. And that's Calum and Vivienne, and we look forward to hearing from both of them. But the podcast goes much wider than that. We try to get into general issues about the whole idea of human education, about the need for education to go beyond simply helping people to know about the Holocaust, but to understand better what caused it. And we would hope to understand better how we can continue to guard against its repetition, although we know that it has been repeated in all sorts of forms since 1945. So it's a wide-ranging discussion, but it allows the voices of two really key speakers and allows them to represent what we think is an outstanding organisation and charity. How did that go, James?
Nicely done, David. You're putting me to shame here. You're doing it so much better than I would. I think that's why I haven't asked you to do the opening bit before. Nicely done, yeah. And what a yes, absolutely, yeah. I do get solicited a lot. I don't want to boast or anything, but a little flex there. But yeah, I get endless emails. And if you're listening to this, not that you will, because podcasts agents very clearly don't, they just get AI to write the opening paragraph, just goes mechanically like, hello, I very much enjoyed listening to your recent conversation about, and then it just says exactly whatever it said in the title, but they've put it into it. Anyway, very transparent. And if you are an agent, don't bother, you will be blocked. But this one came through from Hannah, and yeah, it didn't take, yeah, it was just one of those heartbeat things. It was just like, obviously we should be hosting this conversation. An amazing organization, Generation to Generation, who deal with like spreading the voices, not of Holocaust survivors, of whom there are vanishingly few, of course, now, but their relatives, so that we can sort of keep that candle lit, as it were, and to spread these first and second person testimonies, and to spread a little bit of real world insight into what happened back there. And it sort of, yeah, it was an obvious conversation to say yes to. And I think partly it was influenced by some reading that I'd done about just like the way in which we're seeing this uptick at the moment in lots of how shall we put this gently? Let's say Third Reich adjacent views that have started to take root around the world, right? Just all over the place. And something that I read was suggesting that part of the reason for that is that it's just like a consequence of the fact that we are at this point in time where it was, it's knocking on for 80 years since this happened. More than 80 years now. It's 80 years since it ended, nearly 100 years, right? And we're in a similar situation now, right? We had a financial crash in 29. that set the conditions for what happened in World War II. We had a big crash in 2008, and it does feel a bit like history is repeating itself or rhyming with itself. And it's partly because we're sort of forgetting, like we're losing contact with it, and it just sort of becomes some arcane bit of knowledge which is there to be challenged and sort of disproven, as though it's some sort of, you know, a conspiracy that people have accepted this version of history. And indeed, we're having, you know, Holocaust revisionists and deniers being hosted on the world's most popular podcasts and receiving very little, if any, challenge to their ill-informed views. And so, yeah, bit of a no-brainer. And so, very much looking forward to sharing this conversation with everybody and seeing what people make of it. So this is our first episode of 2026. David, we're recording this on the 13th of January. Somebody said, I listened to a podcast earlier, they said, what a year the last week has been. There's a lot happening already, without wanting to get into the details. But yeah, it just serves to underscore this point that we were just talking about. These conversations are increasingly important. But let's just do a little bit of general catch up. How are you? You look radiant, may I say? How was your Christmas and New Year?
Yeah, great Christmas, great New Year in all sorts of ways. Started off on the 22nd with a visit to Barlands in Glasgow for hothouse flowers. Younger members can Google that.
Blast from the past.
Yeah. But amazingly good, absolutely in top form.
Really?
And yeah, excellent night and a big family favourite. So that was fabulous. And then we had a pretty much family Christmas. All my daughters were home, and that's always a great pleasure. We ceased to be a family some time ago and we've become a gang. And it's just great to share that. So that was wonderful. The only sad element, I think, was that a very good friend and colleague, Juliet Robertson, died during the Christmas period. Some people will know that Juliet's been ill for a long time. She's a well-known campaigner for outdoor education, has a wonderful website called That Creative Star. She has 2 books, Dirty Teaching and Messy Maths. In fact, Juliet and I once had a dirty weekend together. That was how we don't often disclose that on air, but that's what we termed a weekend residential that we did for outdoor educators in Millport in
Good
Scotland.
recovery.
Yeah, excellent. So we had a dirty weekend, and Juliet continued with Dirty Teaching, Messy Maths, but latterly produced a fabulous book called Bloodlines, which is a collection of poems that she's written about living with cancer. And she was truly remarkable. Not long before she died, she was on Radio Scotland, the Out of Doors programme, and she talked about her own death, and she talked about transforming into a goose and flying with the geese into that future. And it was just a wonderful, beautiful moment. And she's somebody that if people aren't familiar with her or her work, they should find out about her because they'll be enriched by that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and I'm sorry to hear about her passing, and I really wish that I'd known her. She sounds like an amazing person. So we'll put links to her books and to her website in the show notes. And there was a couple of exchanges that you had with her. She was on your other podcast recently, wasn't she?
Yeah. My favourite, the one that I've been dining out on pretty much, has been the conversation I had with her, where she said to me at one point that my prognosis has improved. And I was like, that's absolutely brilliant, Juliet. How much has it improved? She said, well, I've now got a question mark. Before it was only 2 to 3 months, and now it's 2 to 3 months question mark. And I just loved the idea that what she did was she then inhabited the question mark, because she outlived every prognosis that was given to her, and she lived within the curve of the question mark. And within that curve, she continued to create, she continued to communicate, and she continued just to be a wonderful, wonderful example of how we should conduct ourselves as human beings in the face of the certainties of death and mortality. So she was just a joy. She was somebody very, very special, and she'll be much missed.
Yeah. Wow, that's beautiful. Wow. Living in the curve of the question mark. That sounds like a title of a book of poems right there, doesn't it? What a beautiful thing. Thank you for sharing that.
I mean, I realise all I've done, James, is make you full up a nightmare because I'm now going to ask you. I'm not going to ask you how your Christmas was, and you don't have a phrase like "living in the curve of the question mark," do you?
You
You're
never
just not
know. You
prepared
never
to
know
do.
what might come out of this fertile mind. I'll just start talking.
Absolutely. Let's
See what
go for
happens.
it. How have you been since we last spoke?
So really good, really good. Lovely Christmas. Lots of family as usual. Um, nice to be back in the saddle. To counter your hothouse flowers, I wouldn't say I'll raise you, but saw a really good gig. A band called White Music for Lovers. No, White Magic for Lovers,
All
not White
right.
Music. White Magic for Lovers. A guy who's from Brighton, Thomas White, and his band, and they have been doing music for years. They used to be an Electric Soft Parade and Breaks, and they've got this long legacy of music, and it's just really lush, lovely, lovely three-piece. They've been touring a lot recently, so keep your eyes out if you ever see White Magic for Lovers. I thoroughly recommend
Great.
it. So yeah, Christmas was good, New Year's good. So I suppose one thing is like, I was talking with my friend Kate, right? So we've been doing all this work in Wales about learner effectiveness, and we've got these 72 strategies, and we're just, putting them out into schools, and it's going really well and everything. And then we sort of thought, like, this is not just kid stuff, like adults are often not particularly well rounded either. Like we're sort of good at some things. Like some people are really good at writing, right? And they write loads of books, but they can't like cook an omelette, or they're not very good at like holding down relationships, or they're maybe really like sort of mean to themselves, or maybe they drink too much, or whatever it might be, right? Maybe they've never been able to figure out how to get physically in shape, right? And so and that's what these strategies, it's essentially a map for like how to become a well-rounded person, how to become sort of self-actualized in a number of different domains, so that you're physically healthy, you're sleeping well, you've got good nourishing friendships and relationships with your family, you're emotionally well regulated, you're kind to yourself, all of that stuff, and it's all sort of well-rounded. And we were thinking that we might develop this idea, and then we sort of thought, well, we need to get high on our own supply, as it were, and see like how well this stuff works, right? And so instead of having a New Year's resolution this year, we're sort of we're resolving to meet once a week and to essentially have a year of resolutions, right? And it's not resolutions, but it's a year of trying stuff out and just seeing what sticks. And 72 strategies. Obviously, not all of those things are going to be relevant for everybody, and we're not suggesting that everybody should go away and do 72 things, but there are 72, soon to be 84 actually ideas, because we're going to add a
Wow.
moral ethical wedge to our life wheel. And so that's going really nicely so far. We've done 2 of these sessions, and it's just a lovely thing. And so I won't bore you with this every time we meet, but I think it would be interesting to check in every now and then, because it really feels like we're onto something with this set of ideas, and we've already had amazing feedback from the work that we've been doing with schools around the world. We had this period just before Christmas where we gave these to schools all over the world for free in return for feedback, and it's just to hit the ground running. People are using them from early years through to year 13, in loads of countries, in loads of different contexts: primary schools, deprived schools, elite international schools, and everyone else in between. And it just seems like this is like a universal recipe for human development and flourishing, right? And so yeah, that's what I've been thinking about a lot.
Yeah, and I think you're right to share that, James. I mean, I do think that one of the things that we we need to do is to stick with your theme of making change stick, which is related to that work that you do. I think that's something we need to pick up. I'm not often taken with it, but somebody posted a clip of me on LinkedIn talking about the nature of change and talking about the need for traction, for grip on the ground, as well as momentum.
Yeah.
And if there's only momentum, the change just passes like wind and leaves nothing disturbed. And that whole idea of how we make change stick, I think, is fascinating. And the fact that you've got resources and you've got other work to support that, I think gives us a bit of a theme that we should rightly and properly return to as we go through the year.
Yeah, I love that idea about traction and about how, like, I was just running a session this morning about oracy, implementing oracy, and we were talking about the difficulties that people are facing. But it's often those difficulties that lead to innovative practice and that lead to this to the change sort of evolving and responding and deepening. And like a number of people were talking about if they're teaching in areas where there's high levels of EAL among parents, they can't access like written communication very easily, or often spoken communication either. And so they've got these really interesting challenges, like how can we encourage oracy to be taking place between children and their parents when we can't communicate very effectively ourselves? And people were coming up with all kinds of innovative ideas, and not just ideas, but things that other people were sharing and saying, we're already doing this and it's really working well. And so yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? It's the grit around which the oyster grows its pearl and all of that stuff, right? It's that's how change happens. It's when our ideas hit reality and actually stay in the moment. It's so easy to just run away when that happens, but it's actually like no plan ever lands and just as you conceived it. That's just not how the world works, and so you kind of need to stick with it. So yeah, and on the making change stick front, just very quickly on that, if I may, I've almost finished making this course, only 1 year late. Making this thing has nearly killed me, and I've been quite distracted this year with all this Welsh work, but it's almost there now, and there are schools who are using it, and it is a wonderful thing to see. And so there'll be more. I'll share more stuff about this. I've been interviewing over the last few months. I've been interviewing school leaders about change, and we're going to have some more of those conversations coming up soon. And they'll be released via this podcast soon. And so keep your eyes out for that. But yeah, there's going to be some exciting developments on the making change stick front.
Well, just before we move on and actually get into the program that we've spent the past week and a half introducing, I'm going to honour the commitment to oracy, and the last thing I do before we hit the button and move straight into the conversation with generation to generation is to give you some other words for Juliet. And it's a poem. It's called Answering the Query. She told me the prognosis had improved. My heart leapt. I asked how much, and she told me she'd been given a question mark. The numbers were relentless, the months were limited as ever, but the query was there. Hope came in a question mark. She answered that query, defied and denied inevitability, and always with grace, always with courage, always with a smile when she could manage that. And she did. She answered all the queries for all of us. Make the time count. Fill it with love and words and meaning. Share the beauty, the courage, and the peace. Leave everyone around you richer. Not a bad note to start the year on.
Oh, mate, thank you for that. That's just so beautiful, isn't it? The hope in the question mark, and a perfect way to segue into this very rich, really quite moving conversation that we had with Calum Isaacs, Vivienne Cato, and Hannah Wilson. I'm not going to say I hope you enjoy this one because it's not really doesn't really seem appropriate, but I'm sure that you will find it enriching and nourishing, and there's just so much in this conversation. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts. If you have any, please do get in touch.
Let's rethink education.
Hello, friends. This podcast is brought to you by the wonderful people at Crown House Publishing. And before we dive into today's conversation, I would just like to draw your attention to an absolute belter of a book that's just been published called Calm Leadership. My camera is a little bit blurry there. Calm Leadership, Staying Grounded, Staying in Control, and Staying the Course by Patrick Cozier, which was described by none other than David Lammy, who's like the Deputy Prime Minister, is he? He was Foreign Secretary until recently, Secretary of State for Justice, who wrote that this is both an inspiring reflection on overcoming the challenges of leadership and a practical guide to harnessing the power of emotional intelligence in the workplace. Since taking on the role of school leader in 2006 and as one of the few Black school leaders in the UK at the time, Patrick has navigated through the complexities of school leadership and has learned to do so calmly. At the heart of this book is Patrick's calm leadership model, shaped over many years of practice, which includes confronting uncalm feelings, adapting to the feeling of leadership, leading people with humanity and understanding, and maturing into the leader you are meant to be. This is an absolute doozy of a book, and I heartily commend it to you.
Let's rethink education.
And so, Hannah, can we start with you? And could you explain a little bit about the work that you do and the work that you do with this organization, Generation to Generation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yep, my name is Hannah Wilson. I'm the outreach officer for Generation to Generation. I'm also a postdoctoral researcher at the Centre for Jewish Studies at the University of Manchester. So I've kind of worked as a researcher and educator in the field of Holocaust studies for over a decade now. Mostly working with higher education students, but some work as a teaching assistant in schools in the Northeast and Nottinghamshire as well. So I've been with Generation to Generation for just over a year now. It's been an extremely rewarding position. So just to give a brief introduction to our organization before we begin, Generation to Generation, or G2G, as we might refer to it in the podcast. It's a Holocaust education charity. It was established to empower second, third, and fourth generation Holocaust survivor descendants to present their family histories to a variety of audiences in the UK. So through the use of survivor testimony, we aim to keep these Holocaust stories alive and challenge anti-Semitism and all forms of racism and discrimination. We're the only UK organization that's solely focused on training descendants to share their own family Holocaust histories, two of whom we're very lucky to have with us today. And of course, as survivor voices become fewer and fewer, we believe these stories still need to be heard, not just as history, but as lived family experiences that speak directly to the present as well. So right now we work with 45 trained speakers, alongside 15 more through our sister organization, the Northern Holocaust Education Group, who deal with counties in the Northeast and the Northern regions. And we're supporting 25 new speakers at the minute to develop their presentations. So in the last academic year alone, we spoke to 448 audiences, so reaching around 45,000 people across England, Wales, Scotland, and some international audiences as well. So about 3/4 of our work is with young people, mainly in schools, colleges, and universities. And we provide speakers from students from Key Stage 2 onwards, so kind of later primary, right through to sixth form. And yeah, our talks support curriculum goals, of course, in history, but also promote tolerance, inclusivity, and critical thinking across a range of subjects, including RE, PSHE, and citizenship. So looking ahead, our focus is on growing the next generation of speakers, expanding our reach beyond London and the home counties. And so these stories can continue to be heard right across the UK. And of course, the 2026 Holocaust Memorial Day theme, Bridging Generations, really brings our work to a very kind of timely limelight. And that's exactly what we're here to do today, to make sure that kind of remembrance doesn't stop and these voices continue to speak.
Yeah, thank you for that. Really interesting. And I think that speaks to this. I love this idea of the generation to generation thing, and this idea, the fact that you're focused on descendants and passing these stories along and these understandings along. And like we might get into this later, but we spoke a little bit off air, didn't we, about how there's been some sort of a change in mood, shall we say, in recent weeks and months and years. And people are like intolerances are on the rise, anti-Semitism is on the rise,
Yep.
nationalist politics is on the rise, people declaring themselves quite happily as fascists and what have you. And there's been some really strange things happening, and it's like we're forgetting these lessons. And I think that it seems to be partly a function of just the increasing distance in time from what happened back there. And so the work that you do is just so vital, and so I'm sure that we'll get into all of that. So before we hear, so we want to spend a lot of this conversation hearing from Vivienne and Calum about your respective the stories of your respective relatives. But first, can we just do like a quick introduction to yourselves, just like who you are and what you do and whereabouts you're based and so on. And so let's start with Vivienne.
Well, hello. Thanks again for having us on. So my background is in education, in teaching and research, in writing, and latterly in Jewish education. And I happened across generation to generation in its very early stages because I met Helen Stone, one of our founders, and she was presenting the story of her mother. And I went up to her afterwards and I said, I also have testimony from my mother, and what can I do with it? So it was just wonderful to me to be able to use my past educational experience and shift the dial a bit towards Holocaust education. And I do feel that this is really a very appropriate place for me to be because I can honour my family history and I can use my professional skills. So it's a great match for me, and I feel very honoured to be doing it.
Lovely, thank you. And whereabouts are you, Vivienne?
I'm in London. I'm in
You're in
London,
London,
but in terms of G2G, I have travelled all over the country. And even though many talk to in London, but I have been all over the place. And of course, like many of our speakers, I've done talks on Zoom to wherever. Certainly during COVID, we were all on Zoom. So with the great benefit of this technology is we can speak anywhere, literally anywhere.
Indeed, isn't it amazing what we're doing right now?
Yeah.
We've sort of become just totally used to it, but what's happening now is just an absolute miracle, isn't
It
it, of
really is. It
technology?
really is.
It's
Yes.
wild. Well, thank you, Vivienne. It's lovely to have you with us. And Callum, could you give a quick introduction to yourself, please?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me on. So I was born in London, still in London, part of a family. So my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. My grandfather was a survivor of being sent to a Soviet camp. So that's heavily influenced my family. That's kind of led to me feeling like this kind of thing is important. And so I'm 23 years old, third generation person who feels like kind of taking on the mantle of telling that story now.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so let's dive into these stories. Who would like to go first?
First.
Okay, lovely. Thank you,
Yeah,
Vivienne. Oh, over to you.
sure.
So we're going to hear about your mother, Eva, or initially Ava, right? But she
That's
became known
right.
as Eva
That's the
later.
European pronunciation, yes.
Right.
Oh, well, thank you. So my mother came from Slovakia, and she was born in 1926. So it's actually the centenary this year, quite remarkably.
Mm.
And she grew up in a small Slovak town in the center of the country as in a Jewish family that was one of a small number in her town. It wasn't a huge presence, but there was a community. And things really started to go wrong with the alignment of Slovakia with Nazi Germany. Slovakia never, well, until the end, was not occupied by the Germans because Nazi Germany didn't need to. Slovakia was playing along quite willingly on its own. So anyway, deportations started following on from general changes in law, persecution, but actual deportations started in 42. Sorry. And at that point, my mother's aunt, who was unmarried, was taken away. The first deportations were of unmarried young people. And that set the alarm bells ringing for my grandmother. and they decided to leave to get out. So my mother and her daughter, sorry, her mother, who are at this point, I should say, a single parent family for, complex reasons, they decided to escape to Hungary, and therefore they spent the next 3 years in hiding in Hungary. Now, I don't mean, like Anne Frank, behind a cupboard. I mean under false identities. So they were in Hungary as non-Jewish people, at constant risk of detection and betrayal and consequent death. Very stressful time. And then they were liberated by the Russians in 1945. And a few years later, my mother came to this country as a refugee.
Right. Thank you. David, do you have any follow-up questions there?
No, I'm really keen to hear Callum, and then I think we can move on and just talk about not only our responses, but the responses that you get when you do the talks. I think that'd be really interesting.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. Okay, Callum, over to you.
Well, so my grandmother, Miriam Finkelstein, was born in 1933 in Berlin, which is not a great time or place to be born as a Jew. And her father, Alfred Wiener, was very involved in the German Jewish community, kind of a leadership figure there, went up and down the country fighting court cases, making speeches against anti-Jewish libel, and was very concerned about, had been concerned for a decade about rising anti-Semitism in Germany. And then various events, the election of the Nazis, um, the events that went from there, and a meeting he had with Hermann Goering, a senior Nazi official, and circumstances around that led to him eventually deciding that Germany was no longer safe for the family. Um, so he and his three daughters and his wife, including my grandmother, one of the three daughters, moved to Amsterdam when she was 1 year old, which they thought might be safe. And then eventually, during this time, Alfred was gathering materials for an archive on what the Nazis were doing, essentially documenting what was happening, documenting rising anti-Semitism. He realized very prescient about the significance of this to history, and then realized at some point that it was no longer safe to keep this archive in the Netherlands, and moved it to London, but couldn't at the time move with the whole family, and worked very hard to arrange for them to get visas, but those visas arrived at the very same time that the Nazis invaded the Netherlands. And so they could no longer leave, the visas were no longer usable. And so they were stuck in the Netherlands under Nazi occupation, and underwent the kind of anti-Semitic discrimination that happened, had to wear a yellow star stitched onto their clothing, weren't allowed to go to various places, and lived in the constant fear of being sent to a concentration camp. And then eventually, in 1942, they came to their street and ordered all the Jews to leave. And they were sent to a transit camp initially, Westerbork. And then after being sent to that transit camp, where many people were sent to death camps, including Auschwitz and Sobibor, including my grandmother's aunt and uncle and cousin who were sent to Sobibor and died there. They were not sent to one of those death camps. They were sent to a concentration camp, Bergen-Belsen, with horrific conditions, hunger, cold, fear, and surely would have died there if they then weren't part of a miraculous prisoner exchange, which those exchanges involved maybe a couple hundred people, very few people. And it was enabled by the fact that Alfred had managed to get for them at some point in the story fake Paraguayan passports, and these facilitated them being part of this prisoner exchange. And so they were saved, but unfortunately, Margareta, my great grandmother, who'd probably been giving some of her food to her daughters to try to keep them alive, when they finally got out to freedom, she died almost immediately. She'd got her daughters out to freedom, but that was it for her. And then my my two great aunts settled in the United States. My grandmother came to the UK and then lived a peaceful, free life and had three children. And her father continued with his library, which is the Wiener Library, which is now the oldest kind of archive on the Holocaust and the Nazi era, and they also document genocide in general, and it's a very significant piece of like area of research for people who are studying the Holocaust or genocide.
It's amazing. There's so much in these stories, I think, both about complicity, which is a really, really important issue. I think the point, Vivienne, that you make about the role of Slovakia and how it responded, I think is really interesting when we look at the world that we live in today. I think some of the issues you're raising around recording, Calum, and around the importance of archives and all of that. They're also interestingly complex tales. You've told them, I think, with a limited degree of drama. These are really straightforward narrations, and I'm not sure whether that's how you do it when you talk to young people in schools. But I'd be really interested to know about your experiences in the classroom and how young people respond to the talks that you give.
Shall I go first? Well, I have to say, I think, and this is true for all of our speakers, our reception is normally amazing and very profound and attentive. I think even with 10 and 11-year-olds, and I've spoken to some year six groups, who, by the way, are wonderful and really seem to know so much and ask so many good questions, right up to adults. But of course, typically we're speaking to year nines because that's when tech schools tend to teach the Holocaust, and we're going in there to help them deliver that curriculum. And of course, the impact of talking about a real person who went through this is so much stronger than just hearing about these abstract figures of 6 million and so on, and gas chambers and what have you. So this is what makes the impact. So there I am, telling the story of my mother. She is there with me on video through video clips, and I have quite a few of them. And luckily, she speaks clearly and movingly, and that's what the young people respond to. I mean, I like to think they're responding to me too, but I think the main thing is that they see the real survivor, and that's what we're doing. You know, we're future-proofing against a time when all of these survivors will have sadly but inevitably gone. I think the vast majority of our talks are about people who have already passed away. Not all, but the vast majority. But there they are, come back to life, living and speaking. And I feel like I'm doing a kind of relay race with my mother. So I tell part of the story, she then carries on the next part, then I continue. So we tell it together, and that's what the audiences respond to.
Yeah, really interesting. I wondered, like, so as you were growing up, Vivienne, like, did your mother, how aware were you of this as a child yourself? Did she talk about it much, or did she talk about it for this video project? But like, how did that play out as you were growing up?
Well, yes, that's a really interesting point. I didn't know very much when I was growing up. I didn't know we were a family with a Holocaust background. Both my parents actually were refugees and survivors in their own way. Everybody around me, I now realize, the extended family and friends were Holocaust survivors. In my time, I just thought of them as continental ladies and gentlemen, but there was a reason why they were all there, and that's because they'd escaped from Europe. But only a few anecdotes. Neither parent was very keen on talking, and I think it's really because they didn't want to relive that for themselves, and they didn't want to traumatize me. So wind on quite a few years, and my mother was invited to do this testimony for the British Library and Yale. It was a joint project. And when she showed me the tapes, I was just stunned because most of these stories I'd never heard before. And I was super grateful to the project for getting these stories down on tape because she wouldn't have told me all that herself.
Mm.
So that was my background experience of growing up. It was there, but it was somewhat hidden.
Right. Interesting. And so let's put the same question to you, Callum, about the responses that you often find when you're speaking with young people about your stories.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, the word I would use is quiet while I speak. I mean, complete focus and attention. And it's interesting because you go into these assemblies and I feel I remember quite recently being at these assemblies and the teachers shouting at us to be quiet and behave. And now I'm the one standing up front as the speaker, which is an interesting experience. And you can see, I think the teachers are scared the kids are going to be kind of disrespectful or something because it's a very serious, weighty topic and you don't want your kids chatting while someone's giving this testimony. But I essentially always, the kids are just like really quiet and well behaved the moment I start speaking. And especially because I also have lots of clips throughout the presentation of my grandmother speaking, and people are very focused and listening in. Um, I feel like the weight is kind of immediately apparent of the story, and it seems to just hit very strongly.
Mm.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The Richard Bregman, who's done the Wreath Lectures this year, I've just finished reading his book, Moral Ambition, and one of the things that he talks about is the need to humanize the numbers. So his examples are all direct narratives, and he has a lot of really good narratives about people who supported refugees and Jewish victims of persecution during the Second World War, looks at their motivation, but it's the same message coming through that you're giving us, that humanizing the stories is far more significant in terms of impact than the numbers. But I'm really interested in the implication that you're making, that there is a reaction and that reaction's been consistent, because as James said at the start, I was really interested to see whether there would have been a change in that. Certainly if you like, the wider climate is far more polarized in terms of people's views. James talked earlier about anti-Semitism clearly being on the rise. We've got all sorts of controversy around the situation in Gaza, all of that. And I'm just intrigued as to the fact that there doesn't appear to have been any change in the responses to your presentations and talks, while the climate has changed so dramatically outside the classrooms.
It's it is interesting, and you're right. I think, and Hannah can probably comment on this too. Our bookings are actually going up, and this isn't true for all Holocaust education organisations. Our bookings are going up steadily, and we get repeat bookings. I think about 50% each year are repeat bookings. So something we're doing is correct. We're kind of doing the right thing somehow. Personally, I haven't had any experience of hostility in any talk I've done. Quite the reverse. I've had pupils, students coming up to me at the end, particularly ones, who are too shy to speak in a big group in the Q&A at the end. And then they come up and that's when they ask the really personal questions. In the big group, they might ask about facts around the story, but coming up to me personally, then they'll ask about how my mother coped psychologically, what it was like for me growing up, even through to questions as to, why, really, why did this happen? And why did people hate Jews? Which is, of course, a very hard question to answer. And I don't really know the answer even now. But yes, the reception has so far always been positive. And as I say, we're getting more and more bookings. So.
Mm.
Yes, I
Well,
think
that's really encouraging, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
I think that maybe like a lot of the change in the changes that we've seen that we've both alluded to, it seems like it's quite an online phenomenon. Like
Mm.
there's partly a function of the way that algorithms, you were talking about polarization, David, and algorithms, and just like the shock factor of people who have outrageous opinions
Mm.
get more clicks and get more attention in that attention economy. And while young people are online, they're they're not watching that sort of polarizing political content so much, are they? Kids are like on TikTok watching, like more frivolous material. I wonder if you want to come in here, Hannah. Like, is there anything that you would add to this conversation about this sort of changes or the lack of changes that you've seen in the work that you do?
Yeah, I mean, as Vivienne said, we haven't seen a decrease in bookings at all. If anything, it's increased actually. And part of me wonders if that is the response of the concern in rising anti-Semitism. But
Mm.
as I mentioned, our talks are also very much about kind of putting these ideas of what happened during the Holocaust in a kind of present context as well, and how they relate to kind of looking for those early kind of signs of prejudice. But also, I think a lot of them emphasize that anti-Semitism didn't just come from nowhere during the Holocaust, right? It was something that had existed for centuries, and kind of that development of how things like anti-Semitism came to be, and how they obviously then get, much more extreme when we see circumstances like war or sort of the rise of political parties that weaponize it. And just to come to your point about online information and misinformation, I mean, certainly in Holocaust studies, this has been a concern for a long time, especially students being exposed to Holocaust content that is related to kind of AI generation and deep fakes and so on. I think in 2022, UNESCO did a study about Holocaust content online, and 17% of Holocaust related TikToks, for instance, were proven to either be spreading misinformation or kind of related to Holocaust distortion. And students are, of course, exposed to that. And it poses an additional challenge for educators then to kind of to combat that with, with good research and research informed teaching, and but especially then the role of kind of this personalized knowledge and grounded, information being grounded in real human stories that GGG can provide, I think is a good way to kind of counteract what they might have read online or what they've seen online. Or if they've learned something from the presentation, they can think, well, actually, no, that isn't what we heard, that isn't what we learned. So I think it's just so important to still have that human connection and remove that kind of responsibility of these online platforms for teaching students. Yeah, it's a concern, but I think it's something that can be challenged, definitely.
Yeah, thank you. I think you nailed it in that phrase. Just like the human connection is the counterpoint to that, because like I'm pretty certain that you are not deep fakes.
Yeah.
Like human connection is just and it's so, and like you were saying, Vivienne, about just like the specific, rather the particulars and the granular aspects of these stories are what really makes them hit home often, isn't it? And rather than talking about these broad strokes. Calum, I was wondering if you had anything to add to that. Just I'm interested in like the have you noticed any sort of, is there a differential in the way that children of different ages respond to your stories? Or perhaps if you've gone out into different communities, do you get out into like the full range of different types of communities around Britain and perhaps internationally?
Yes, I've spoken in quite a lot of different contexts to different age groups. I've also spoken in a prison, which was interesting, universities. So a whole different range of contexts. But to be honest, the questions often are quite similar. The questions often, you know, when did she tell the story? Did she forgive them? How did it affect how she lived her life? How does it affect your family? Those
Mm.
kind of personal questions and certain kind of specific questions about the story and what happened. Those are often the general. And what can we do about rising? That's often more and more common the older you go. What can we do about rising anti-Semitism and intolerance in society? But it's often similar kinds of questions. And I think it is interesting that hostility, no kind of hostility or difficult things have come through so far. And I think that is, I mean, as you say, social media. it's a separate thing. It's kind of people on their own writing these things, and when you're coming face to face with these things. But also, I feel like it's a very, very small portion of people that will be faced with these true, important stories and then react as a human in a way that's kind of has any kind of hostility. I think there is an increasing risk of that kind of reaction, especially with kind of certain things going on in America, and the kind of, I'd say, rising disrespect towards the memory of the Holocaust there, and that can come over here. That concerns me. I don't think I've seen it in giving these talks, and I think kind of the key thing about what we're doing is like it is really human because it's connecting it to people as people that were in our families, and it's real stories, and all of that kind of washes a lot of that immediate kind of intolerance that people have away. And also why it's good to kind of get people young in a way. Kind of it's good that we teach these things at year 9, when you're in that kind of formative stage of your worldview and how you think about the world. I always felt in school, especially around the age, these kind of things were very impactful on me. I don't know if I was a particularly influenceable child, but I was saying, I think even like, the people who come in to give the drug talks, they talk about these stories of people who've done hard drugs and kind of how it like ruined their lives. And that really influenced me, or like people coming in talking about like streetwise people, all of that stuff I found really influential at that age. And, I was exposed to a lot of Holocaust education. All of that stuff, I think, can be really impactful, especially at that time in your life.
I'm very conscious when when I work in schools, that schools are in very different contexts. I was in a school recently surrounded by St. George's flags, close to the hotel in Enfield that was under siege, effectively where the alleged asylum seekers there were being physically threatened on a regular basis. I'm conscious that I'm often in schools which are clearly predominantly Muslim, depending on the nature of the community which they serve and all of that. Do you feel that you get invitations from a representative range of schools? Do you feel that you are in demand in schools which might be Muslim majority? Do you feel you get demand from schools where clearly reform or associated right-wing groups have got a really clear hold in the wider community? Or do you feel that to some extent you're getting the opportunity to speak to those who are willing to listen or perceived to be willing to listen?
Let's rethink education.
Hello, everybody. I will keep this short and sweet, so no need to reach for that skip button. We love making this podcast, and with over 600,000 episodes downloaded to date, it seems like people out there are enjoying it too. In fact, we even hear from people from time to time. It is a labor of love, though, with the emphasis on both the love and the labor. Producing each episode involves reading books, carrying out the interviews, obviously editing them, paying for the increasingly bewildering array of tools that keep a show like this running. Most people don't realize, but podcasts like this rely on support from people like yourselves. Right now, we have 27 patrons who help us to keep this show going. If just 1% of our listeners joined them at patreon.com/repod, we could sustainably create even more of these amazing conversations, which I think are increasingly urgent. There are various tiers to choose from with different benefits attached to each tier, starting from as little as the price of a cup of coffee or herbal tea per month. Or if you prefer to make a one-off donation, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com/repod. Either way, if you just want to carry on listening, please feel free to do so. And thank you very much for being part of this community. Now let's get back to today's episode.
Well, maybe Hannah can talk about that. Personally speaking, I've been to a whole range, as they say, from Muslim majority schools through to very white rural schools. Yeah, a complete mix. It's true that most of our requests come from the southeast at the moment, but that in itself is also a mixed area, despite what sometimes think. I've also worked in the northeast with our sister group, the Northern Holocaust Education Group. Again, very, very different demographic, but it just shows that we do, between the two groups, get around the country quite successfully. Hannah, I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, I think the bookings really, or understanding where the bookings are coming from, I'm not necessarily sure at the minute we can really say, like, in relation to kind of areas that reform are kind of getting more popular. As Vivienne mentioned, we're just the minute the kind of the one of our main goals is to expand, for instance, more into like the Midlands, like East Midlands and so on. So I don't really think the bookings are hugely impacted by that, really. But of course, what then students might bring with them from home, that might, be kind of relevant as to what they're already kind of have in mind about some of the topics that we cover. But yeah, for the minute, I think we, as Vivienne mentioned, there's a real range of schools, a real range of backgrounds of students. And I don't really feel, just from looking at the bookings, like there's a kind of a clear consensus that we have more from one type of school or more sort of more from another. I think it's just a real mix, a real blend.
I mean, I think one of the points is that, in England, Holocaust education is compulsory in Key Stage 3, not in Scotland or Northern Ireland or Wales, but it is in state schools in England. So schools, I think, find it really helpful, regardless of the kind of school they are, and I'm including independents and academies and so on, to ask for one of our speakers to help them convey this material in the most impactful way, and to complement, what they're doing at a more abstract level in the classroom. So it's really to everybody's advantage that they get to hear such a speaker. And we all know that having a guest speaker, and like Calum said, can make a real impact on young people. And we've seen with survivors going into schools, as they have been doing so valiantly for so long, that's what people remember. That's what young people remember, seeing that person speaking to them. They have met a Holocaust survivor. And what they actually, the story was, maybe fades, but they know that they've met them. And, we're not, luckily for us, we are not survivors firsthand, but, we're the next closest thing. Mm-hmm. And we'll come to be seen as the closest you can get. I feel even now that sometimes the reaction to me is subtly, oh my goodness, this person grew up with a Holocaust survivor. And I had the benefit of having had a very comfortable, privileged, non-persecuted life, but I have known what it's like to live with, well, several Holocaust survivors. And that's something you're not going to get anywhere else.
Yes, I was wanting to ask about that because, like, in both of your cases, in the brief account that's on the G2G website, in Eva's story, it mentions that she and her mother were two of only 15,000 Slovak Jews to have survived the war out of a pre-war population of 90,000. Calum, this thing with the Paraguayan visa exchange thing, it just sounds so tenuous, and it's like if that hadn't have happened, you wouldn't exist, right? I'm really interested in, like, just how has this impacted your own, sense of identity and just how the shape of your lives. It's a bit of a big question to ask, but I'd be interested to get some sense of that.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has for me, which is something I think I realize more and more as I get older. And I start the presentation. The kind of theme of the presentation is miracles, and as you say, the kind of tenuousness of the whole thing, and how there are these different points along the way we're extremely lucky, and each being a symbol of all the millions of people who didn't survive, and also all these things are reasons that I'm alive and I can be here speaking, and that is definitely something that that I think about, and I think and it influences me and my family's kind of politics in the sense of like an appreciation of the stable, peaceful, relatively tolerant society that we live in, and that context creating the freedom that we enjoy and the institutions and the rule of law that allows that all to happen. And I think, I mean, just in terms of their kind of personalities, both my grandparents didn't react very strongly to kind of personal slights or had big dramas in their life. Things to them, I think, seemed quite small in significance relative to what they'd experienced as children. And that this then kind of translates politically into a kind of sense of an appreciation, which I think is a key word, and also kind of the importance of sustaining these things and fighting those kind of big evils that always lie beneath the surface. And there are all these things we argue about, but at the end of the day, those key things that we need to fight against happening, always keeping that in mind, and in the meantime, really enjoying the freedom we have. I think that definitely affects me massively. Yeah.
How does that affect your talks, both of you? You know, particularly you, Callum, because you've mentioned it explicitly, but you've got this wider ambition through G2G about combating racism
Yeah.
in the widest possible sense, as well as anti-Semitism specifically. And what you've just said, Callum, is hugely revealing. That whole piece about the setting within which racism can thrive, within which anti-Semitism can take root, the importance essentially of at least a liberal society, you know, and that's a real extension from the bearing witness part of what you do. You know, we've talked a lot about you are the human representation, bearing witness and carrying testimony from generation to generation. But you're also messengers, clearly, potentially about something much, much wider. How do you handle that? How do you handle that containment, if you like, within the personal narrative and that wider message that you're putting out? Because essentially you are campaigners for a very particular viewpoint around tolerance, around a whole set of values that are critical.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because we're teaching history, as you said before, like tell the stories we kind of take, or at least I feel like I'm kind of taking the drama out of it, kind of because I feel like they speak for themselves. And the clips from my grandmother speaking about it, she also doesn't kind of, there's no kind of dramatic extra added to it. It's just telling what happened and how she felt, and just that has this kind of power. And nearly all the presentation is just explain the story and what happened. Part of that story when I tell it is, my great grandfather and how he had this archive and how that was kind of a big mission in his life. So immediately that kind of has a side message that's coming along with it. The way I kind of think about it is that the emotional power is just implicit in the whole thing, and that almost anyone hearing that is going to think, well, firstly, this happened, so it's real, and knowing that the risk of it happening is real. And secondly, this sounds so terrible. I should care about preventing anything like this from happening again. But kind of sprinkled throughout are these more talking about how it affected my family, like I just did, talking about how it makes us appreciate the freedom we have, how it kind of influenced my family. Each of my grandmother's children went into public service of certain kinds, and all of that. I mean, at the end, there's kind of a message, a wrap up, which is, all of these miracles happen to keep my grandmother alive and keep my family going. And so many people didn't experience that, and you shouldn't need miracles to kind of survive as a minority. So there's that, and these kind of sentences sprinkled throughout of these messages, but nearly most of it is implicit, I'd say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to put the same question to you, Vivienne. Sorry
Yes.
to interrupt about the impacts, that sort of original question about the impacts on your own
Yes.
life and worldview.
Yes. I think despite having said that I didn't have that much knowledge growing up, I think I did experience a sense of that I was particularly lucky to have been brought up and born in a time without post this persecution. I mean, my mother
Yeah.
would say repeatedly that she lost her education to Hitler, which she did. She was in hiding during the years of her secondary education. She, as it happens, then lost her tertiary education because of the communists, but that's another story. Anyway, so I was made to feel very much a lucky person to be able to go to school in peace and calm and privilege, if you like, and get on with it. And that therefore there was a kind of obligation actually to do well and to make the most of it because it wasn't a light thing that I was there. And in fact, one of the stories I did seem to know and that I now use in my presentation, was told to me in the sense that it was really a random chance that I was alive. And I'll just explain quickly what I'm talking about. In 1942, when the aunt I mentioned earlier was taken away and sent to Auschwitz, she managed to drop a note out of the carriage window. There was apparently an ordinary train at that point, not a cattle truck. She was a smoker. She had a cigarette packet with her. She wrote on that cigarette packet, "Don't follow." She added the address. She dropped it out of the window. And somebody, whose name I will never know, noticed this packet, picked it up, bothered to put it in an envelope, bothered to pay for a stamp, and sent it off. And it was received. And as a result of that, my mother and grandmother escaped to Hungary.
Oh my goodness.
And I tell this story, and I often will come back to that at the end of the presentation and say, you just don't know what small action that you take, what impact that can have on someone's life. And I say, if that person, I think of it as a lady, could have been a man, if that person hadn't done that task of picking up the envelope, the packet, I would not be here. I would probably not be here. So that is in itself a message not to be a bystander. And to, for example, call out racism if you hear it. You know, it's just not okay to tell an off joke or to call someone a name. And you just don't know whether that's that little contribution towards building up an atmosphere of intolerance and hatred that leads to persecution and death. I mean, not every name calling results in genocide, thank goodness. But genocides do start with name calling.
Yeah. And that's a really useful, I think, and powerful example of the wider impact. I mean, one of the things I'm always anxious about, and I was a history teacher, is that sense of how it becomes easy to focus on the event. It becomes easy to think on the Holocaust as something that happened under the Nazis in Nazi Germany. If you read Leonardo Padura's book, The Heretics, which is the story of the liner carrying Jews from Europe, which was refused entry into Cuba, it was refused entry into parts of the United States, you know, that the Holocaust didn't just happen in Auschwitz and the other concentration camps and death camps. It happened all over the world. It happened in various ways with various degrees of complicity and so on. And I think there's something really challenging about getting that message out, that this isn't something that the Nazis did at one point in time. This is something that has happened. You started off the conversation in this way, Hannah, in various degrees and forms at various times to Jewish people. It happened in other ways and similar ways to Black people. It happened to Indians under British colonialism, you know, and there's something about how do we prevent young people from saying, well, that was the Holocaust and that was terrible and it must never happen again, when the reality is that it echoes through our present times and it echoed long before that through past history. Does G2G make an effort to deal with that? wider concept, or how do you avoid the risk of, if you like, the Holocaust focus?
Yeah, it's difficult given that we only have 40 minutes. And we have a lot to cover in that time as it is. But we do always ask our speakers to include in their presentation something about the other groups. That's not a very felicitous phrase, but the other groups were also targeted by the Nazis. The fact that it wasn't, as you say, just the Nazis, let alone Hitler, who was responsible for this. It was ordinary people carrying out vendettas against the other. And we do mention genocides in UN approved, as it were, genocides that have happened in history not that long ago, like Cambodia and Rwanda and Bosnia and Darfur. So we do include prejudice. We do refer to prejudice and violence against other groups. I do wish we could be part of a week-long program that would cover the whole thing, but sadly we have usually maximum an hour. We've even been asked to do talks of 15, 20 minutes, which really doesn't allow for that much depth, sadly. But yeah, in 40 minutes, we can do a pretty good job of telling our story, making a moral case, referring to other atrocities and other prejudices, and encouraging, our listeners to really, whatever it is, but just do that tiny bit to make the world a better place. Just it might be really small, but you don't know how big an impact it might have.
Really interesting. I wonder if, like, Hannah, I'd love to bring you in just to build on that point about like, what does good Holocaust education look like, and also, are there any sort of potential tripwires here around like educating people about the Holocaust and then sort of indoctrinating them into like uncritically sort of accepting this worldview, this sort of set of beliefs and ideas, and it's like you need to go our way and behave in such a way, right? Which is, it's not just educating people, it's sort of saying like you need to take a stance and it's like it's quite political, right? And that's been quite a hot issue in this country in recent years. The government issued, and that it sort of went away as an issue, but the government issued some guidance around, how can teachers, especially of history, navigate this path, as it were. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that, and whether there are any sort of do's and don'ts, perhaps, any potential dangerous areas that you could get into in this area.
Well, just in my experience, like I think firstly you can't expect teaching students about the Holocaust to then teach them all the life lessons, right? Like it's one step of many that educators can work towards to kind of instill, as has already been discussed, these kind of broader ideas about, what is prejudice, where does it come from, how is it spread, what are the signs to look out for. And I think a lot of organizations have done a lot of good work to do that and look more comparatively at things. The Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, for instance, established the kind of the 10 stages of genocide that is a really useful tool for actually teaching the Holocaust, but also then can apply to to teaching about other genocides. And I think also Holocaust education and the development of it really did set the precedence for then teaching about other instances of genocide and violence as well, which I think is really interesting to look at. So for instance, teaching about Bosnian genocide, there's a lot of interesting ways to collaborate between different organizations who teach about these things. And I think that's really important as well. I think what is just so important, and a lot of these issues we've kind of covered, is just about teaching the Holocaust in a way that isn't just like good, bad, Germany versus everybody else, about really expanding students' knowledge of the role of ordinary people, as has been mentioned, about kind of complicity, both kind of national and on a kind of more local level, and about how that really kind of developed in relation to the Holocaust and how it occurred. Because even today, students still have it's generally gotten better, I would say, over the past decade, but students still have a very kind of Hitler-centric view on how it happened. And I think that it kind of putting the role onto one evil individual then really clouds or makes it harder for students to understand how societies collapse, how prejudice spreads, and how ordinary people are affected. So I think their ability to kind of connect with some of the wider concepts that we introduced, like racism, anti-Semitism, I think that's really integral for them understanding that. And I think, yeah, they just, in terms of teaching the Holocaust, you just have to make it accessible by introducing personal narratives and personal histories on a kind of micro level. Then, you know, the numbers don't really mean anything to students. So it's really about kind of focusing in and giving, I mean, the examples that we have with Vivienne, with Slovakia, for instance, as, you know, being this kind of quite exceptional place of collaboration, and of course, Calum then, you know, broadening the perspective outside of Europe, right, to South America, and quite a lot of Jews ended up in, you know, in Shanghai, in Peru even. So kind of thinking also outside of the Europe-centric scale, I think, is really important as well. It's really this global thing that happens. And then, of course, bringing it home to England and being part of British history and the British story as well, I think is really important. So I'm not sure if I've totally answered your question there, but I think just really grounded in research. And also, you know, there is a lot of pressure on teachers who were never really given a clear pathway of what should be taught about the Holocaust. You know, as you mentioned, it's part of the curriculum, but there's never still been any really kind of clear guidance as to how to teach the Holocaust. And I think there are some amazing resources now about that can help teachers kind of externally, like digital resources, and of course organizations like ours. But again, it's kind of up to the teacher to access those and to be aware of those in the beginning. So I think that's really kind of important to remember that, you know, there are just so many great resources available now of how to teach this in a way that is really impactful and really meaningful. And kind of into thinking about the do's and don'ts of teaching the Holocaust, I think there is a lot of support now as how to teach it well and in a way that makes an impact. And, you know, G2G really, I think, can kind of complement teachers and the efforts that they put in.
There's a really interesting point about whether we're teaching the Holocaust or using the Holocaust. And I think it's particularly interesting in the context of how the wider debate about education in England is conducted. So if you're thinking in terms of knowledge rich, you teach the Holocaust, it's a subject. And in a sense, what G2G does, it has a mission to make sure that people know about the Holocaust and the experience of it. But that knowledge is valueless, I think, in G2G terms, unless it also brings a wider understanding about some of the issues that you've touched on today, like bystanderism, like that wider sense of awareness that if we do not live in a democratic society, we are at constant risk of the recurrence of events like that. And wherever we've seen democracy endangered, we have tended to see Holocaust-like echoes running through that. Cambodia, Somalia, the Balkans, all of these areas. And I think that there's a really interesting issue around the language that we use when we talk about teaching and using and so on. And it's a difficult balance, I think, because like you, I want people to know that something desperately awful happened to millions of Romas, of LGBTQ people and Jewish people during the Second World War and before that. But yeah, I mean, your point, Hannah, about let's make sure that we let people lift their heads up and realise that this is not some issue centred around one particular movement and one particular dictator, but something we have to be mindful of all the time. And that, I think, has been a lesson that you've managed to get across today in this conversation. And I hope that it's a message that comes across really strongly in all of the work that you do through G2G. So a huge thank you to you for that work.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
So I wonder if do you have any final words? Let's just do a little round. Callum, I noticed you nodding a bit there. Did you want to come in on anything that David was just saying?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that idea of like teaching values and what are you actually trying
Mm,
you just tell people what they should care about, what to believe. I mean, not really. But I
Mm,
guess what you're trying to do with education is kind of provide a sufficiently or as deep as possible understanding of the world, both knowledge slash intellectually and also emotionally, in order to kind of approach it and, in a sense, construct a worldview. And the kind of intellectual slash knowledge based side of that is like thinking about just the historical component of how does this thing come about? Is there this complicity involved? What are the political factors? What are the circumstances? And recognizing that this applies also to today. And then there's also the emotional side of it, which is that kind of idea of truly taking it to heart, truly thinking, putting yourself in those shoes, which I guess is difficult to do in the classroom. And so that's part of what we're kind of doing by giving our talks. So then you kind of combine those things of thinking about it historically, intellectually, and also thinking about it emotionally, and you try and instill in people that kind of grounding and understanding of the world, and then you and make the point that it's relevant to today. The kind of going from there to thinking we really need to do everything to stop all these things and also recognizing all the ways that it materializes, that's difficult and kind of you have to hope it kind of goes from that base.
yeah. Thank you. Do you have anything you'd like to add, Vivienne?
Well, Calum put it very well. I think it's for me it's very much about helping and hoping that our listeners really buy in to the messages that we're putting forward, that they feel a personal association with it, and then they can make the connection with what's going on today. So despite the fact that it's, nearly a century ago, they can relate to it and take it forward. I mean, Elie Wiesel is well known for saying that once the witnesses to the Holocaust have gone, like he was, it's the job of everyone who's listened to a witness
mm.
to be that witness. So we are witnesses. Our audiences are witnesses, and we want them to both retain that story, so it's not lost, and to take the message of that story out into their lives and be guardians of a free and peaceful world.
Thank you. That sounds like a perfect note to end on. Other than that, I would just want to bring in Hannah for a final word from you.
Yeah, just to say thank you, of course, for having us today. And just, I think it's, in times like this where it can feel quite dark and quite scary, like, I think we can take a lot of encouragement in the responses that we get from students. And also, I get the feedback forms. And sometimes the feedback is just so moving and just so encouraging. And it just really drives home that, this is such an important work and such an important organization. Um, and I think we can actually put a lot of hope in the younger generations to really kind of engage with this history, if we do it, in a way that's accessible to them. So I think that's great. And just to note that we accept bookings all year round, all throughout the academic year, not just, of course, the Holocaust Memorial Day. So please take a look at our website. It's generation2 you can read some of our speaker stories on there. You can book a speaker via an online form. We are free of charge. Donations are always very much accepted and welcomed because we are a charity. But just to note that, we're available all year round. So we really hope that some of our listeners will engage with our services.
Amazing. Thank you so much once again for getting in touch, for reaching out, for suggesting that we have this conversation. Thank you to Vivienne and Callum for joining us, for sharing your stories. Just incredibly moving and thought-provoking. I'm going to reflect on this conversation a lot, and this conversation is called Rethinking Education, right? And that's what we need to do here. I think that at the moment, we see the world that we see, and like you said, it feels a bit dark. It feels like things are not going in the direction that it needs to. And we have the education system that we have, right? And if we were able to turn the needle on what happens in schools, by inviting more people like yourselves to come in and do your work all year round, as you were just suggesting. That's part of it. But we're really interested in how we can do more of this human connection stuff, which to me, I think, is the answer and the antidote to all of this online polarization, is just to like dial up the extent to which young people are able to ask questions, to meet one another, to not just sort of sit in rows and be told stuff and drilled, about stuff, but to explore the world in their minds and to make meanings for themselves, right? And to generate their own values that they're going to live by. And what a wonderful organization. My goodness, it's a beautiful thing that you do. So congratulations on the work that you do, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
How it is and how it should be, are wrestling in the streets again. One's got the other by its expectations. The other is going for a submission. Hope has stoicism by the neck. Acceptance is struggling for breath. 'Cause driving has it on the ropes. What I want is being choked. My wheels being dragged through a hedge backwards. Not before it bloodied the nose of the world. Happy as it boxed the years of change. Contented, assaulted. Progress with a change. May you find kindness under that stone. May the thaw come early this year. That bridge should be finished this year. You can go